Work Wellness Institute is transforming research into workplace performance and health. As an organization, we function throughout the complete cycle of turning research into practice, mobilizing knowledge as a research institute, community partner, funder, and educational provider. Our mission of creating safe, healthy, and inclusive workplaces for all is our driving motivation. Learning is a lifelong journey to adapt to the forever changing needs of the workplace. Whether you are a leader, a professional, an academic, or a student, we provide high-quality resources that are evidence-based, topical, and relevant to all industries. Choose the Work Wellness Institute as your learning journey partner and become a member to gain full access to our diverse knowledge mobilization programming, including lectures on demand, e-curriculum, 3 distinct certification opportunities, and more. Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we can support transforming research into performance and health for your workplace.
Hello, welcome everyone. Whether it's the morning, afternoon, or evening, we're so appreciative of you spending the time with us and being here together this morning in learning, or again, afternoon or evening. So an official welcome to you all for joining Workplace Mental Health through an intersectional lens. My name is Elizabeth White, and I am the Manager of Programs with the Work Wellness Institute, and I'm here today to help host and moderate today's session. I would like to start by acknowledging that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. This webinar is made possible through the support of our funders, partners, as well as memberships to the Work Wellness Institute. And we would also like to, of course, take a moment to thank our advisory committees and speakers who contribute to this webinar series and make these sessions happen. Very excited to be welcoming Dr. Vicki Kristman as well as Polson, who is a PhD student for our session today. Just a quick moment on their background. So Dr. Vicki Kristman is a professor in the Department of Health Sciences and director and senior scientist of the Epic at Work Research Institute at Lakehead University, which is located in Thunder Bay, Ontario. She holds a Lakehead University Ontario Research Chair in Injury and Disability Prevention. She conducts research to better understand factors associated with health, particularly mental health, which we'll be discussing today, and disability in the workplace to develop and test interventions to improve the lives of workers. Polson, who again is a PhD student currently with a research interest in understanding the psychosocial factors that may impact our health. Kara is interested in furthering the scientific and public understanding of how we can utilize the workplace to improve mental health outcomes. She has recently completed her master's in health sciences with a specialization in epidemiology. And as a current PhD student with the Epic at Work Research Institute, Lakehead University Department of Health Sciences, Kara continues to explore the implications of working remotely from home as it relates to mental health outcomes. So very much looking forward to the presentation and discussion today, and I'm happy to pass the baton over to you, Kara. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to everyone on the call for joining us today. It's exciting to be here. So yes, we're going to be talking about mental health in the workplace today, particularly through what we call an intersectional lens. Before I jump right in, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So the Epic at Work Research Institute respectfully acknowledges its location on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. We're located here in Northern Ontario. We acknowledge that we are currently on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robertson Superior Treaty of 1850. We are committed to the reparation of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and researchers by forging partnerships founded on the principles of respect, reverence, and reconciliation, and to conduct research that is led by Indigenous people for Indigenous people and with Indigenous people. So let's start with the idea of intersectionality. What is it and how do we define it? So much of what I'm going to discuss today is an argument for a multidimensional, comprehensive approach to studying mental health in the workplace. So another way of saying that is intersectionality. Intersectionality is the recognition that our identities, such as our race, our gender, our economic status, these do not exist in isolation, but rather they overlap. And they create a really unique experience of either privilege or oppression, depending on what our life experiences or identities have been. So, to get you thinking about this in relation to your own situation, if you were filling out this web for yourself with short words or phrases, and we can see we have the individual at the center, and then just from the center, we have very things like our age, our gender, our ethnicity, what region we live in, what social class we belong to. What aspects of your identity feel most central to who you are? Have any of these identities given you advantages in certain situations or maybe disadvantages? Have any created barriers for you? Or how do different parts of your identity intersect to shape your experience? Really, intersectionality is a complex way of saying that we're all incredibly unique. If we look at this web, there's all these different factors that influence who we are at the center. And it can impact how we see the world, how we experience health outcomes, mental health outcomes in particular, how we might address mental health, how we might address mental health in the workplace. So with this as a backdrop, let's move on to understand workplace mental health. And I'm going to begin this portion of the presentation by advocating for the importance of understanding this area of research. Mental health is more than simply the absence of a mental illness. It's recognized as an important indicator of overall health and progress in a society, and it's a risk factor for a number of chronic physical conditions. And the World Health Organization, way back in 2004, and very many since then, has said there is no health without our mental health. And when we look at the economic impact of mental health in Canada in particular, 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental health problem in any given year. This will cost the Canadian economy $51 billion. Notably, looking at this graph, 39% of this is related to work-related causes. So $20 billion of our mental health concerns are related to things that are happening in the workplace. And this can be direct costs due to things like healthcare, loss of productivity due to people being absent, or indirect costs, which are more challenging to quantify, but can be very significant. So these can be things like poor performance, the costs associated with recruiting and training new people if we have increased levels of turnover. So mental health is a critical aspect of our overall well-being, and the workplace plays a very significant role in shaping our mental health experience. The average Canadian spends 30 to 40 hours per week working, and nearly half of Canadians consider the workplace to be the most stressful part of their daily life. So that's pretty significant. And why is that? Well, we know that there are a number of factors in the workplace that are impacting employees, and this is based on the research. So number one, limited support, insufficient assistance and resources for employees, high job stress and strain. There's a lot of demand leading to physical and mental fatigue, a lack of control. So employees are feeling powerless over work-related decisions in the workplace, conflict in the workplace, so disagreement and tensions among colleagues or among supervisors, management. And finally, work-life balance challenges is a significant one. So people are really struggling to manage their personal and their professional lives. Poor work-related mental health can reduce employee satisfaction, engagement, productivity, and it can increase our healthcare costs. And we have lost work time over time. But is it worth investing in mental health in the workplace? Absolutely. So for every $1 invested in workplace mental health, an employer can see a potential return of $1.50 to $3. This can be due to reduced healthcare costs, improved productivity, or decreased absenteeism in the workplace. So we know that it's an incredibly important area to research, and we also know that by prioritizing it, we can see a reduction in the economic burden related to this problem as well. So I've organized my presentation sort of around 3 key pillars. If we really want to understand this important issue, we need to have a significant understanding. Firstly, we need to deeply understand what is workplace mental health in isolation on its own as a concept. Secondly, we need to take a critical look at the current initiatives that are happening in the workplace to address it. And then finally, we need to look at challenges that exist in this field, whether you're an employee, an employer, or a researcher working in this space. There are significant challenges that we need to address. So let's start with this first pillar, conceptualizing mental health first. If we're trying to understand mental health on its own, there are a number of traditional frameworks that conceptualize it in a rather simplistic manner, in that they don't include a holistic picture in all that can impact mental health. So it makes them less than ideal for research purposes here. Both of these models that you see on this screen provide us an idea of how we can define mental health, whether there's complete or incomplete mental health. But it lacks an understanding of all of the factors that can influence mental health outcomes. So it's really important when we're in this space, we're avoiding simplistic models like this, and we're moving to comprehensive models, such as this. So here's an example of a model by the Public Health Agency of Canada. It's an evidence-based framework, and as you can see, comparative to the last slide, here we have nearly 24 factors that should be considered when we want to understand an individual's mental health or mental health outcomes. If we circle back to that idea of intersectionality and we picture that web of identity, this model right here is a great example of a comprehensive framework taking an intersectional approach to understanding mental health, but at the individual level. And we can see if we look at the individual on its own, we're looking at what are their coping mechanisms? Have they experienced violence? What's their spirituality background? And then it broadens right out to look at society as well. So this is the type of model we want to use if we're working or thinking about mental health in the workplace. Now, when we begin to situate mental health in the workplace, there are a number of traditional conceptual models that exist as well to illustrate this relationship between mental health and the workplace. And I've provided 4 examples here. There are more in the literature, but these are 4 of the more commonly used. We have the job demand control model. Just as it sounds, we're looking at the demand in the workplace and the amount of control that the employee has and how that relates to health outcomes. Similar to job demand and resources. Are there a lot of demands, but are there resources, also supports to support an employee who's under a lot of demand? There's the effort reward imbalance. Are you putting in all this reward or effort with little reward? That can result in poor mental health outcomes. And finally, the biopsychosocial model, which looks at biological, psychological, and social factors that can influence employees' outcomes in the workplace. And I'll work through 2 of these as an example, and I'll show you the type of information that we garner when we use these traditional models and how they may be lacking. And right now I'd like to introduce a case study. This is Sam. So she's an employee, and I'm going to use her as an example to illustrate strengths and weaknesses of different models as we move through the presentation. So let's use the job demand model as a start. So Sam is required, is she under a lot of demand? Yes. She is required to manage multiple projects. She has tight deadlines under excessive stress. And on the bottom, if we assess her job control, she has limited autonomy, no flexible working hours. There's no option for working remotely if she's having work-life balance challenges. And she has no input into any of the strategic decisions or strategic planning. So limited autonomy. We know she's going to have issues. We likely be stressed out and possibly burnt out. High demand, low control leads to increased stress and burnout. But how can we help her with this information? We don't have enough information here really to understand her full experience and ultimately how to provide her assistance. Just by lowering her demand, we don't know that that will truly improve her mental health outcomes. So we see the gaps with one of these traditional models here in this example. If we move to the biopsychosocial model, we can conceptualize Sam's mental health more comprehensively because now we're looking at biological factors, so chronic stress and the health impacts due to her work conditions. We're looking at sociological factors now. So we're addressing emotional strain and what coping challenges exist in the workplace, but we're also now adding in social factors. So what's the workplace culture like? What is the support like in the workplace? So we're starting to become a little bit more holistic with this approach. So let's walk through the example. So we're assessing the 3 areas. If we start with the biological, she has a chronic stress response due to the high level of work, elevated cortisol levels, she might be fatigued, experience insomnia, the list goes on. She's going to have some physical symptoms due to increased stress. We start to look at the psychological factors. So the type of individual she is, she internalizes pressure and she doesn't have an output. She has a lack of coping mechanism. So now we start to see, okay, so she is at risk for something like burnout or depression or anxiety. And we are addressing her lack of coping mechanisms and her inability to handle pressure. So we can start seeing how we might be able to provide supports to her that are more tailored to her as an individual. And then finally, when we look at the social factors, so what is that workplace culture like? Is productivity over well-being prioritized over well-being? There a lack of inclusive policies or microaggressions in the workplace? And what about cultural stigma? So who she is as an individual coming from a minority community, perhaps she's discouraged from seeking help, that I need to be strong all the time type of mentality. We're getting a much more comprehensive idea of who she is and how we might be able to help her. However, again, using a critical approach to understanding these models, we're still missing a number of key important considerations. We go back to that intersectional approach again. What about power dynamics that might exist in the workplace? Does she feel comfortable going up the chain to management or not? While there is some recognition with this model of social factors, this approach really is putting the emphasis back on the employee. It's all about Sam. What are her strengths? What are her weaknesses? What could be contributing to her mental health outcomes? But there's little to address structural conditions that could be causing an employee stress. If we were to build an intervention based on this, again, we're very likely to miss key variables of consideration and likely result in short-term gain. We might improve things for the short term, but not for the long term. So what if we take what is called an eco-social approach? So this is a more robust approach to studying workplace mental health, and it incorporates intersectionality at the core of it. It integrates social, biological, and also environmental factors. Krieger's theory of how social inequalities and power structures influence health outcomes, it's because individuals embody things over time, which means there is a connection between the individual themselves and the larger social and ecological forces at play. Here's a visual of the eco-social theory, and you can see it's very different. It looks similar to the Public Health Agency in that there's a lot going on, but in terms of those traditional models, there's no comparison. We're looking at an individual through the entire life course, as you can see at the bottom. What was their infancy like, childhood, and then adulthood? What are the different social and ecosystem impacts? So if we look at the individual right up to the global level, things like the American election might be influencing our workforce. So it's recognizing everything that's going on in someone's life. So if we're to conceptualize workplace through mental health via an eco approach, the key difference is that there's a societal accountability that creates conditions that can harm our mental health. For example, there could be workplace policies that fail to address mental health or caregiving needs. It reflects a broader systemic neglect. Social norms and expectations about race, gender, and productivity can contribute to unequal distribution of stress and resources in the workplace. And going back to that idea of embodiment, what this means is that individuals are taking on or they're internalizing social and environmental conditions that they encounter through their lives. For example, employees are embodying or internalizing workplace stressors such as high demands and exposure to discrimination, which can contribute to mental health issues. So let's look at an example of embodiment, because sometimes this can be a challenging construct to visualize. If we look at structural and organizational factors, so for example, an organization is prioritizing productivity over well-being. Work hard, we're not concerned with your well-being. This is an example of broader societal systems of capitalism and inequity, and people can internalize that, and they're no longer prioritizing their own well-being. If we think of cumulative exposure to stress, continued exposure to long hours creates, as we saw in previous examples, a sustained physical stress response that employees internalize. If we think about discrimination and power dynamics, so perhaps Sam feels excluded from colleagues. This represents broader societal power imbalances, which could be based on race and/or gender. And finally, thinking about historical and contextual factors. So Sam internalizes this belief that she needs to be strong. This is a cultural stigma about mental health in minority communities. We've seen this in the literature. We can have all the resources in place, but based on who she is and the culture she comes from, Sam may not, for example, access an EAP program. So again, really getting back to the root of who are the individuals that need help, and they're all going to approach mental health differently. So if we're getting conceptual mental health in the workplace, we want to use an eco-social approach for a number of reasons. There's a number of strengths. First, there's this systemic focus on structural inequalities. So wage disparities, systemic discrimination, and job insecurity. Unlike individual models, this model highlights the cumulative effect of all of these inequities on mental health, and advocates for organizational policies that promote equity, diversity, and inclusion. It integrates the social determinants that can influence health outcomes, working conditions, job securities. All of these factors can shape mental health outcomes. By addressing these foundational elements, this framework supports a longer-term change. There's that emphasis on intersectionality. So it really incorporates this idea of understanding how individual and overlapping identities, for example, race and gender, socioeconomic status, all of these compound with stressors in the workplace. It is a holistic and multi-level approach, so really comprehensive, looking at all of the factors in someone's life. It recognizes historical and cultural context, really important, going back to ensuring that mental health initiatives are sensitive to experience of marginalized groups. For instance, the framework advocates for workplace policies that acknowledge intergenerational trauma among Indigenous employees or systemic barriers that are faced by minority groups. It creates a more inclusive and supportive environment. So that brings us to the end of conceptualizing workplace mental health. And I hope I've drilled home the importance of taking what we call an eco-social approach, emphasizing intersectionality, understanding the whole person. We now know that it's an important issue, but what are we doing to try and fix the problem? And I'll comment on some workplace interventions, identifying challenges, and provide some suggestions. So firstly, we have the national standard for mental health in the workplace. And I was going to ask the group to raise their hand, but I won't be able to see anyone raising their hand. But I just want people to think about, and maybe I'll ask this in the discussion, have you ever heard of this, the national standard for mental health in the workplace? It's a framework. It provides guidelines for employers and policymakers to identify workplace risk factors that might influence mental health outcomes. It's very robust and comprehensive, and it has improved some awareness. However, only 17% of Canadian employers are even aware of it, and very few have even implemented it. So while it's a great tool that has been developed, it's not being used. So I'll be curious if we can touch on that in the discussion, and actually maybe I'll ask the group then. Other workplace interventions, so EAP programs, employee assistance programs, the employee has to take it upon their own accord to reach out to this service. Mental health awareness training is very common right now, training to improve mental health knowledge. Flexible work arrangements, we're seeing this more and more post-COVID, of course, helping people adapt their work schedule to their personal lives. wellness programs. So programs for overall well-being. And we see things like, again, mental health improvement, mindfulness training. We've even seen yoga programs in the workplace, which is great. And we just see overall wellness programs to help employees improve their overall health, nutritional programs. And then also leadership support training. So training leaders to be more supportive of their staff. We have all of these great programs here. Many have been proven to be very effective in certain workplaces in the literature, but yet we're still seeing mental health problems in the workplace. And why is that? And we see a number of programs being underutilized in certain workplaces. So in this image, I've highlighted some key issues that I think, and we know based on the literature, are really part of the root of the problem. There's a number of significant challenges that I'd like to bring your attention to. So starting on the left, intersectionality. So probably the 20th time I've said that term in this presentation, but in the literature and in the workplace, we're seeing employers failing to really recognize the diverse needs of employees. And it can be challenging, and I'll touch on that in a little bit, but that is a big challenge. It's that a lot of these interventions aren't appropriate for all of the employees. There's a lack of awareness, despite the fact that we have all this mental health awareness training and we're seeing it in the media. There is a lack of awareness in the workplace of how common it is, and it really reduces the effectiveness of any interventions that we may have. The organizational culture can be a big challenge, fostering unsupportive environments so folks don't feel like they can go to get help or can seek accommodation. There's limited resources, particularly for smaller businesses. They don't have the time or resources to provide support to their employees. And finally, perhaps one of the largest is stigma. We still have stigma hindering open discussions about mental health among employees and employers. If we move towards an eco-social lens, we can see a number of positive outcomes. So structural risk factors will address. By addressing these root causes that I just went through, organizations may be able to shift from reactive measures to proactive strategies, preventing mental health challenges before they arise. We talk to organizations about using this type of approach. We can shift the organizational culture, hopefully reducing stigma, encouraging collaboration, promoting resilience among employees, leading to improved mental health outcomes. And really, this approach recognizes the diversity of individuals in the workplace. And it can be a challenge because there's policies put in place for a reason, but we need to perhaps broaden out some of these policies to address the diversity in the workplace. It is a multi-level intervention design. So the eco-social approach looks at individual level support, but also what systemic changes need to happen in the workplace. Workload management and flexible work arrangements maybe need to be implemented in order to improve outcomes. And it also includes open conversation between different levels, employee and supervisor levels. Sustainable change. So the biggest strength with this approach is that it focuses on sustainable change, ongoing initiatives. It's not simply let's implement an EAP program and the problem will be solved. No, it's regular mental health assessments of the employees, leadership training, continuous feedback systems to foster a resilient workplace over time. Moving on to this final and most important piece, all of the challenges that we're dealing with in the third pillar is what I'll talk about. There's a number of challenges that we face as researchers, employees, and employers when we're talking about mental health in the workplace. But first of all, how do we know what we know? There's a large body of quantitative literature out there, meaning we're measuring things, we're using numbers, but there are some limitations and gaps. Firstly, there's a lack of robust data collection. So quite often we're failing to measure things like culture or workplace factors, things like supervisor support. So what that means is we can see uncontrolled confounding. So we might not know what is truly leading to that mental health outcome if we're not collecting a wide range of variables. Much of the data is primarily cross-sectional. So we're measuring individuals at a certain point in time, and then we're saying yes or no, they are not struggling. Well, what we know is mental health can change from day to day. It can change based on the season or what's going on in the workplace. We really need to be following people over time in order to ensure we understand what's happening in the workplace and what can be resulting in mental health outcomes. We don't truly know what's causing mental health. There's a lack of causality, and there might be bias. Selection bias is a big concern in this area, particularly when we're looking at who's participating. Individuals that choose to participate in a research study often are the ones that are really interested in the outcome. Mental health, as an example, these are the people that want to have their voices heard and see change happen. So we might be seeing these people selectively coming into the study, and we might see a higher representation of people struggling in the workplace for that reason. When we look at the qualitative literature, so this is when we're sitting down with people and talking about their experiences and we're trying to understand their stories. Again, there's limited discussion really on individual differences, trying to get at the root of those problems, stigma, perhaps cultural approaches to mental health. There's limited number of qualitative studies in this area, and it really lacks that sociological perspective, really trying to understand what's happening even outside the individual level. And then moving on to mixed methods. So there is a small sliver of knowledge in the area of mixed methods, which means it's combining both quantitative and qualitative. However, again, we're seeing a lack of robust data collection or consideration for individual or societal factors. We do advocate for, from a research perspective, to approach from mixed methods, meaning both. We can capture the complexity this way by measuring certain variables, but then also sitting down with individuals and talking about their unique experience. We can address diversity, the what and the why are things happening. It can enhance the validity of our findings, so one study can support the other side of the study, can help us better understand interventions, why they're working and why we're seeing particular outcomes. Again, it accommodates intersectionality and diversity, and it has a lot of practical applications and policy recommendations, and it really does bridge the academic and organizational perspectives. So eco-social approach sounds amazing. We should all be doing it. However, there are a number of challenges working in this space if you want to try to understand everything about everyone and everything that's going on around them. Starting with the red, it's methodologically complex. There's an intricate design to collecting all of these variables and executing the research methods, particularly when you're measuring a lot of variables. There's challenges when we're quantifying diverse eco-social factors. Contextual variability, it's hard to measure all of these things when sometimes as researchers we don't know what we don't know about someone's story. It can be challenging to get folks from different disciplines to collaborate with one another. Epistemological shifts, so that's essentially what are individuals' viewpoints and how can we get different viewpoints to work together to enforce change. And then organizational barriers. So quite often, again, going back to small businesses, there are obstacles that are hindering research from progressing. Organizations that are smaller don't have the time to participate in research all the time. Key considerations moving forward. Number one, we want to be thinking about that intersectionality to enhance the understanding of everybody at the individual level, that diversity that exists. We want to encourage collaboration, fostering interdisciplinary insight and innovation. And then from the research perspective, really specifically, we want to be measuring people over time to see how things change over time from a mixed methods approach to research. And then I want to throw it over to Vicki now to give some consideration to what can employers do from a researcher's perspective.
Great, thank you, Kara. And yeah, the challenging after Kara's just indicated how difficult it is to conduct research. It means we don't have a lot of really strong evidence around intersectionality and mental health. So what can we do? What can workplaces actually do? So I think most workplaces have really specific policies in place, and we actually generally advocate for that. And I'm not saying we should just dump all our policies, but I think we should try to be a little bit more flexible with those policies and really try to understand holistically an individual when they approach with a challenge, or if we lot of people aren't even going to approach. As Kara said, some particular cultures, it's their culture is to not reach out for help, but to try to deal with things individually. And so if you see someone struggling, I think really it's upon the workplace to start to approach people and say, hey, I see you're struggling with this. How can I'm a supervisor, for example, is there anything we can do? Try to reach out that way and really try to understand all the employees as individuals, not as a big, this is all the employee group, but rather as individuals. Again, as Kara said, we can't know everything about everyone. Even in the PHAC model that was shown, there were just 24 variables there. And there's so many more that we don't even know that are important yet. So it's impossible to know everything about everyone that could potentially impact someone's mental or physical health for that matter. So really it's important to acknowledge that we don't know everything and to try to be as open and understanding, bring empathy to the workplace more and more, really to create a space, a psychologically safe workplace where people do feel that they can come forward. So the more we can make the environment feel that way, the more likely someone might be able to come forward and actually start to speak a little bit, even if they're encouraged to do so, because people might not necessarily just do it on their own just because of their cultural background. Also allowing for cultural expression in the workplace. I think this is a really important point. I have visited mining through some of the research mining different mines from some of the research we've done, and many of them have created, had the employees themselves build a TP where the employees could go to do their cultural smudging or whatever it is that they felt they needed to do. So they have this space that they created for themselves. So it was for them, but the employer allowed them to do that. There's other work and other examples, or maybe offices that have spaces for people to do prayer. Whatever it is that the employees, if you understand your employees and who they are, what can you do to give them the space and allow them to do what they need to do to maintain their mental health as well? So it's not just all about providing mental health programs. Some of these things don't resonate with certain cultures. So it's really allowing employees to be themselves and know what they need and have the opportunity to have that provided either for them or give them the opportunity to create it so that they can do it themselves. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen even within our research institute is just open, honest communication. We need to be very clear with how we speak, because not everybody can understand as well as we necessarily think. When we speak, we think we understand what we're saying, but not everybody understands that. They don't get it. It's either sometimes we could be speaking too quickly, or just the language that we use. Language is incredibly important. So I think we need to be really careful with how we say things in addition to what we say, and make sure that it is very clear and assure that we get understanding before we just move on. I think that's another challenge. It's not just to make sure that we're communicating, but part of communication is also listening and ensuring that the staff, or vice versa, staff or employers, is hearing what is being said. And as Kara indicated throughout the entire presentation, excuse me, really to think about this intersectional lens. And it's very difficult. It's not easy because there's so many different things that make up a person. Like as Kara's example, we're really to think about yourself. What are all the things that make up who you are? This can be very, very challenging to have policies that can capture all of that in that information. So it's really trying just to make policies open and flexible as possible, so that as needed, you can modify these things to ensure that you're capturing and supporting all of your employees as equitably as possible. And again, as we said, allow for more flexibility and also exceptions. Use policies more as a general rule, and then but have the option to break them or identify exceptions as well. So from a employer's perspective, this is a very challenging thing to do, just as it is from a research perspective. And I think the more we attempt to do this and try to, we will get better at it, but it will take time. And that's why we just have to do the best, I think, that we can right now. But it all starts with awareness. If we're not aware, we won't even try. So I think building awareness is where we start. And then from there, we try to continue to advance and incorporate these things into our workplaces. So with that, I think that was, is there anything else there?
Yeah. Just wrap up with some, and to echo what Vicki's saying, it's nearly impossible to incorporate intersectionality into policy or even into research. It's nearly impossible to know everything about everyone, but just having the conversations and leading with acknowledging we don't know everything about everyone and going from there can hopefully foster some change in the conversations that we're having. So we'll wrap up with some concluding thoughts and summarizing the presentation today. So mental health significantly impacts individual and organizational well-being, and we know that it can be costly. A holistic approach is essential. We need to address individuals, organizational and systemic factors that could be influencing outcomes. And this eco-social framework really does provide us with a comprehensive perspective. It integrates social determinants and systemic influences, and really should be how we're moving forward in this space. Future research should be focused on intersectionality and collaboration. From a researcher's perspective, we really want to see more longitudinal mixed method design following people over time. And it provides us with a commitment to long-term vision and interdisciplinary collaboration. This is essential for fostering resilient workplaces if we can all work together. Before I move on to discussion, I just want to acknowledge that the research that we're sharing today was funded by Equity at Work Research Institute with the support of the province of Ontario. The views that we expressed here today are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect those of the Institute or the province of Ontario. So with that, we'll move on to questions and comments and some discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was incredibly thorough and I think really brought forward a lot of food for thought. Get going on our first question here, and it does lead off of the great conversation, Vicki, that you started around what organizations can do. But when we're thinking about that very first step, so as you have mentioned throughout this presentation, it is a real shift kind of coming out of those traditional models that a lot of policies, a lot of things have been structured around. So if we're looking to just do that first thing, that first conversation, that first something, to introduce this even as an option when looking at mental health, what advice do you have for those workplaces that are really just on their starting journey of making that shift?
So yeah, my advice would be awareness, is to really build awareness with the employees, and also to show that the employer actually cares about this. This is a big, I think a lot of employees don't think that employers really care, and showing that you do care and showing openness, I think is definitely a start. And trying to build awareness, showing that the employer is making an effort to understand intersectionality and all of the things that in mental health in the workplace. I think you'll get more employees coming forward with ideas of how things can be done in the workplace to help them. And I think that's really what we want to make sure, that you're addressing your employees' needs by providing supports. And it's difficult to, if you don't know what the employees need, it's difficult to do that. So I think just being open and really starting to have these conversations, be it sessions, and it'll take probably time, because people are going to be uncomfortable at first, especially if it is a big culture shift for your workplace. People are not going to just turn on a dime. It's going to take some time, and they really have to see an effort by the employer to see that, yes, this is something that's really important to the employer. They're making an effort. They want to engage with employees, etc. So I think that would be, to me, the first place to start, is just to really build awareness and to show that this is something that's important to the workplace.
I think that's a wonderful point. Just even that, as we mentioned, there's so many that won't even come forward, and it sometimes gives that permission of, oh wait, this is on on the agenda, or something that I can discuss. And on that point, from the actual employee side that maybe is experiencing mental health and has multiple layers, as we all do, to themselves, and is sitting in a culture that's not bringing that awareness, not having those conversations. How would you speak to those employees that might be sitting wanting to reach out for help but aren't sure how to start that conversation?
In terms of the employees, so employees generally, it's difficult because you want, again, employers can try to make them as comfortable as possible, but it's with employees, it's as Kara was mentioning, all those independent aspects of an individual, that's going to determine how comfortable they are coming forward. So again, if it's not something that's in their culture, it's going to be really difficult for those particular employees to want to come forward. But often those might be the ones that we need to hear from the most, because they're the ones we don't know as much about. So yeah, so again, I think the best approach I can think of is just to try to be open. Oops, sorry, my dog's in here barking at the door. So it's very difficult, but again, it's just trying to be, I think, showing empathy and trying to understand as much as possible someone's situation. So asking questions of employees, I think, and really listening to the answer, I think is also a really, really important thing for employers to do. But for an employee who is maybe a little bit nervous about coming forward, potentially they can find allies within the workplace. So there could be support groups set up within the workplace. If there is somebody that can be a champion for a particular aspect of intersectionality, so a particular variable, maybe race, whatever, age, whatever, there could be a group where there is a champion and it's somebody that they feel that they can talk to. It doesn't always have to be the supervisor or management. It could be somebody within the workplace that has maybe a stronger voice, and maybe they can listen to what others have to say. So I think there can be groups set up within the workplace, or even individuals who are wanting to sort of be the champion of this, that can be a go-to person within the workplace.
So I think that brings forward something, team dynamics, right? That
Yes.
can actually be a real strength and contributor to a multiple voice situation. Perhaps there's sometimes strength in numbers that can feel more comfortable. So changing into, we discussed those initiatives that do tend to be in the workplaces, and there are challenges to those, particularly coming from that intersectional lens. So as whether you're the employer, the human resources manager, or what have you, your role is that person that's looking at those initiatives or booking that training or providing those. What are some of the things that they can look for to ensure they are a more robust, a more fulsome approach, and hopefully, again, we can't know everything about someone, but kind of what to look for, what the pitfalls are maybe, to ensure that those support systems are helping as much as we are intending them to.
I'm thinking first you need to take a look at your employees and think, well, what could they possibly be struggling with? Is it workload? Then maybe we need to think about acknowledging that the workload here is heavy, and let's implement either a way to reduce workload or a workplace stress intervention. So look at your employees and take a hard look at what they could be struggling with, but also not what they're struggling with, but who are your employees? Do you have a bunch of male construction workers, and perhaps yoga is not the best way to alleviate stress? So we want to think about things that are appropriate for the people that you're working with. It's about getting to know your people. If you don't know your people, how can you help them or implement something? So really first take a hard look at who you're helping and what your workplace could be doing that's not helping them as a start.
Yeah, and I think I would just emphasize too, Kara, that a lot of employers will do surveys with their workforce to try to better, especially if it's a large workforce. Smaller workforces, it's generally easier to you have those one-on-one conversations because it just happens. There's smaller, fewer employees. But when you start to get more employees, it's very difficult to have the time to have one-on-ones with everyone. So often we'll use surveys, and that's the national standard, Canada's national standard on psychological health and safety, has, I think, started to make people aware that these surveys can be very helpful around that. I think the standard recommends the use of guarding minds. Literature has shown that that's not the best approach. It's not going to actually identify what are the most important factors that a workplace needs to address. So we're actually conducting a research project right now to try to better understand what are those factors for different industrial sectors, because I think it varies by workplaces. So it's really important that we try to best understand, and sometimes we can't do it just by having one-on-one conversations. Those are always good. Even with larger workplaces, you want to learn as much about your employees as you can, but sometimes there's just so many that it's not feasible to do that. So I do think there is a place for surveying your staff and understanding where there's gaps and listening to them in terms of what they think is important, making open-ended questions in these surveys that allow people to give their thoughts and ideas, because sometimes the best people who have the solutions are the ones who are experiencing the challenge. So
Just to follow up on that with surveys, are there some best practices to provide on that? As I know, sometimes there is resistance from employees to participate in surveys, or anonymity and anonymity, you know what I'm trying to say,
yeah.
can be a concern as well. So just, maybe some best practices on how to mitigate those resistance.
Yeah, so definitely there's challenges around confidentiality and privacy, particularly when you are talking about mental health. And if employees want to know that their job is not going to be put in jeopardy if they respond to something and something is learned about them. So definitely making it anonymous. From the workplace perspective, a workplace, and often the best way to do that is to have a third party come in and do the survey for you, because then it's one step separated from the management of a workplace, right? So having somebody come in to do that type of work. One of the studies that we're doing right now, the Northwestern Ontario Workplace and Worker Health Study, we're actually doing this for workplaces where we will go in and conduct it, but we're doing it as under a research project so we can better understand and identify what are the important measures and what are the best, if we can narrow it down to a short survey instead of trying to recognize, as Kara showed, there's so many different variables you have to think about. It gets impossible to try to do that. So we're trying to identify what are the few key things that will really help you to learn more about your staff and what you need to do. So those are what we're trying to do right now. So research is ongoing in this area. There's lots that we need to learn yet. So I can't specifically specify one thing to do. If somebody's looking for something right now, I would recommend here in Ontario, we've got OCAL, which is the Occupational Health Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers. They actually have, if you go onto their website, they have something called Stress Assess, which is designed for workplaces to use, and workers can go use it themselves as well. I would say right now, based on the evidence that we have, this is one of the best tools that's out there that can be used. But as I said, there's research being done right now that hopefully in the near future we'll be able to comment further and have better assessment tools.
That's wonderful. And someone in the audience has piped in of the importance, as we've all talked about today, of not just doing and taking the survey, but then actually implementing or sharing results or having those conversations that come out of the survey. So it's a full circle here. I see that we're just coming to the end of our session, so I'll leave with this last question, just around there's multiple players, if you will, in this conversation, right? There's the employer, employee, we've discussed quite a bit, human resources, disability management professionals when we get into accommodations and leaves and the research and academic. So there's lots of people in the sandbox, if you will. So just speaking to how we can work together and really be partners in arms and advocates together in making these changes that we've discussed today.
Yeah, and that's a huge challenge because you've got union and labor dynamics in workplaces as well, and there's also government players in terms of policies that get put out often provincially. So there's a number of different players, like as you said, in the sandbox. I think what we need to start doing though is to try to affect the workplace so that we're all on the same, essentially we're all on the same team at a workplace. When you think about it, the workers want to do a good job. They want to be productive. They want to produce for the company. But often the management doesn't always see it that way. And I think it's really trying to change perspectives to see that everybody is on the same page and to try to work more together and have open and honest communication. Because one thing I do find is that workplaces they'll be considering things, but they won't share it with the employees. And then employees never get an opportunity to provide feedback on what might be being considered. So I think it's starting those open and honest conversations earlier before you've made specific decisions necessarily, and have employees be involved in the decision making, I think can also empower them as well. So it's really breaking down these power structures that have been created within workplaces, and that is difficult, as our workplaces have been this way for a very long time, so it's going to be a very long haul to make these changes, but I do think in the end it will make for a much more healthy and productive workplace if we're able to overcome these things.
Absolutely. And I think that is the core, that we're all on the same team. We're all looking for those same results and same hopes. So that's a wonderful keystone to hold on to as we move on into these challenges. I want to thank you so much, both Kara and Vicki, for being here and having this conversation. And as we mentioned, kind of one of those first steps is opening the door to conversation, opening the door to these thoughts, and having the ability to share in learning and experience. So thank you so much for providing that opportunity to our audience today. Just before we head out, I want to, of course, again, thank you, Vicki and Kara, as well as our audience for being here and being a part of the conversation today. Once again, I'll just end with a thank you so much to our speakers as well as our audience for joining. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day and we're able to connect further. All the best to everyone for your day.
Thank you.
Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we're transforming research into workplace performance and health at www.workwellnessinstitute.org.